All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into one of the longest, bloodiest, and frankly, most symbolic battles of the entire war in Ukraine, the fight for the city of Bakhmut.
So let's just start with this quote, because it really sets the stage. When military analysts call this the bloodiest battle since World War II, that is not hyperbole. We're talking about descriptions that draw these really grim parallels to the trench warfare of World War I and the street-to-street fighting of Stalingrad. It was absolutely brutal. And that's the big question, right? How did this fight for a relatively small, kind of tactically unimportant city spiral into this vortex for two massive armies? It became a symbol of defiance for one side and an almost costly obsession for the other, turning into a meat grinder that just chewed up soldiers for months and months on end. So, yeah, how did this place become the epicenter of it all? Let's unpack the strategic thinking, or maybe the obsession, that turned Bakhmut into the focal point of such a long and intense fight. The motivations here were just worlds apart. For Russia, taking Bakhmut was a stepping stone. It was part of their bigger goal to capture the entire Donbass region, and they saw it as a gateway to other key cities. But for Ukraine, defending it became about something so much more. Yeah, it was a transport hub, but it grew into this powerful symbol of their will to resist. President Zelensky himself even called it the fortress of our morale.
What's so wild about this is how the fighting itself changed over time. This wasn't some quick, decisive battle. Nope. It was a slow, agonizing, month-by-month grind that really earned it that awful nickname, the meat grinder. You can really break the battle down into these distinct, horrible phases. It started with these gradual Russian advances on the outskirts back in the summer of 2022. Then, by winter, it had just evolved into this muddy World War I-style trench warfare. Then, in early 2023, the fight moved right into the city itself, a horrific block-by-block battle, before Russia finally claimed control of what was left in May.
And this quote right here, it just captures the pure devastation. By the time that street-to-street fighting was really underway, the city was completely unrecognizable. People who were there described this apocalyptic landscape, comparing it to historical battles like Verdun, where the artillery literally reshaped the earth.
Now, to really understand Bakhmut, you have to understand the tactics. This was not conventional warfare. A massive part of this story revolves around the Wagner Group and its particularly brutal methods. So Wagner forces really spearheaded this assault, and they relied heavily on this incredibly costly, almost ancient tactic, the human wave attack. The goal here isn't finesse. It's about overwhelming Ukrainian defenses with just sheer numbers and relentless pressure, no matter how many lives it costs. And this whole strategy was fueled by a massive recruitment drive in Russian prisons. These former convicts, reportedly as many as 50,000 of them, were often sent in as the very first wave of an attack. Their job essentially was to be human bait, to draw Ukrainian fire, expose their positions, and make way for the more experienced Wagner fighters coming up behind them. Casualties weren't just expected, they were baked into the battle plan.
You can only imagine the psychological effect this had on the defenders. Ukrainian soldiers on the ground talked about these relentless, seemingly endless waves of attackers in really stark terms. They called them zombies because they just kept coming wave after wave, right into the line of fire.
So what was the cost of this strategy? Well, it was staggering. Just absolutely staggering, both in human lives and in the complete destruction of the city itself. The numbers are, well, they're hard to wrap your head around. A U.S. National Security Council estimate from May 2023 suggested Russia had suffered over 100,000 casualties, that's killed and wounded, on the Bakhmut front just since the previous December. And that number is actually backed up by the head of Wagner himself. Yevgeny Prigozhin admitted that over 20,000 of his own fighters were killed in the battle, and he even said that half of them were those recruited former prisoners. Now, Ukraine also suffered immense losses, there's no doubt about it. But Western intelligence suggested the casualty count was incredibly lopsided. A NATO assessment from March 2023 estimated that for every one Ukrainian soldier killed in Bakhmut, 5 Russian soldiers were killed. That is a brutal exchange rate by any measure. And the city? It was pretty much erased from the map. Months before it was even captured, the vast majority of its infrastructure was already gone. President Zelensky even went so far as to compare the total destruction to Hiroshima, saying there was, quote, nothing alive there, all buildings are destroyed. Okay, so After 10 months of this horrific fighting, Russia claims victory in May 2023. But the question that just hangs over this whole battle is, what was actually won? And this is where the debate really heats up. Russia claimed it was a tactical victory. They'd secured a logistics hub. But critics say it was a purely symbolic win, driven more by prestige and a kind of sunk cost fallacy, where they'd already invested so much they couldn't back down. And while Wagner claimed its goal was to grind down the Ukrainian army, many Western officials called it a classic Pyrrhic victory, a win that came at such a staggering cost, it felt a lot more like a defeat. And the story didn't even neatly end with the capture of the city's ruins. Get this, even as Wagner forces were planting their flags in the last few blocks, Ukrainian troops were launching successful counterattacks on the outskirts. They claimed to have the city in a semi-encirclement, which threatened the very same Russian forces that had just taken it, and really complicated any claim of total control.
So in the end, the battle for Bakhmut is just this brutal, grim lesson in modern attritional warfare. It leaves behind a legacy of almost unimaginable destruction, and it forces all of us to ask a really fundamental question about war itself. When a victory costs this much in blood and treasure, what is its true value?